All right, but first, we got Russ Latino, the president of Empower Mississippi, in to talk income taxes and whatever else Russ wants to talk about. Welcome, Russ. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity, as always, to visit with you. It is a lovely day outside. It's crazy. I call this fall spring. We will inevitably have another little cold snap.
Yeah.
But it's nice to get out and get some vitamin D and feel alive again. So appreciate you having me on.
You bet. All right, so let's set the stage here. We got a bill over in the House to address income taxes, or just taxes in general, because it's got some other features to it as well. But its primary objective is to ultimately eliminate in totality the state income tax. And then we've got the measure in the Senate. Takes a little different approach there. It eliminates the 4% bracket, reduces grocery taxes, slight, very nominal decrease of license tax, leaves the general sales tax rate at 7% in place, and then there's this one-time $1,000 direct payment that is kind of on a sliding scale, 5% of tax liability last year.
So up to $1,000 as a one-time rebate.
Yeah. And doing some quick calculations on that, looking at the 5% bracket, that means you'd have to have roughly a $20,000 tax liability, which means you'd have to have taxable income of about $400,000 to get the full $1,000, the minimum amount being $100,000. But that's a one-time deal that I guess the Senate felt like with the surpluses we're generating, we got the money to just send some money back out one time to taxpayers. But quite a different approach, a different structure, different models. I know you've done some modeling. I've done some modeling. I think the speaker's done some modeling as well. We're all kind of getting a little wonky there. What are you thinking?
Yeah, so I would say, the House plan is a plan to eliminate the income tax. The Senate plan is not a plan to eliminate the income tax. The Senate plan is a plan to do away with the 4% bracket, which applies to $5,000 of your income. And so when it's fully implemented, we're talking about $200 of savings and continuation of the 5% income tax bracket that applies to most of your income across the board over that first little bit.
Yep.
So the House plan, so people understand it, because I think there's been a lot of confusion. There really are three pieces: the elimination of the income tax, the two pieces that sort of fit around grocery tax reduction, and then the car tax credit, which is a 50% car tax credit and a reduction of the grocery tax to 4%. And then there's an offset in the general sales tax to raise it essentially to 8.5%. So the way that the income tax elimination works is literally in year one, if you make $40,000 as a single worker, you pay no income taxes in year one. Your total tax liability is wiped out. If you make $80,000 as a married couple, your total tax liability is wiped out. And then the rest of the income tax is eliminated using what's called a fiscal rule. It basically says all the revenue over a certain percentage of gain will go towards paying down the rest of the income tax. The end result of the House plan for somebody with $30,000 in taxable income, when you take into account the income tax elimination, the grocery tax reduction, the car tag reduction or credit, and then the sales tax offset, you're looking at something like a $1,350 savings every year. Yep. If you're doing sort of average spending allocations across those things. If you're an $80,000 couple, you're looking at about $3,700 in savings a year. So what you're comparing with that and the Senate plan, the amounts are just night and day, right? Yeah. I mean, the House plan returns far more of state taxpayers' dollars than the Senate plan does, really by an order of magnitude or more in many cases. So we're talking about 10x in it, right?
Yeah.
I think the Senate's argument is that their plan is more fiscally responsible and that we don't know what revenue will continue to do in the future. I personally believe that there is a path forward, and it may not look exactly like the House plan. It may not look exactly like the Senate plan, but there's a path forward for the state of Mississippi to be aggressive, Gerard, and eliminate the income tax in a way that will be transformative for our state. And I think that priority is right. So the governor's priority in saying, I want to eliminate the income tax is correct. The speaker's priority in saying, I want to eliminate the income tax is correct. What we've got to be able to do is address the concerns of folks in the Senate that aren't sure whether or not the math works. I believe the math works. I think we can get there. And look, we continue to be encouraged that both sides are at least having some conversation. At times, those conversations are going to be heated. But I think the end result of everybody sitting at the table is that we have a much better chance of doing something that's going to put money back in the people of Mississippi's pocket.
Yeah, I agree with you as well. One of the things that I've requested, Russ, the fiscal note that the LBO prepared on the House plan. They haven't done one yet that I'm aware of, a fiscal note on the Senate plan, because I'm not sure the Senate plan has actually been fashioned into a bill at this point, right? I think it's just a proposal. Framework.
And the revenue bill deadline hasn't occurred yet. So
right.
That's not like it's out of sorts that they haven't released the bill yet.
Yeah.
But they will eventually release the bill. I mean, I think it's just important for people to understand. One proposal eliminates the income tax. The other proposal eliminates taxes on $5,000 worth of income. That results in a $200 net tax cut. So they're very, very different in terms of size.
Yeah.
I think the current moment that we're in provides interesting context, Gerard. So and you've probably been talking about it, you're blue in the face, we had a 7.5% inflation number yesterday. Monthly, we are seeing larger and larger inflation numbers. So year over year, if you've got $10 in your pocket, it's worth 7.5% less than it was last year in buying power.
Yep.
That means the people of Mississippi in a year's time have taken a 7.5% pay cut when it comes to buying power. And they don't have the ability to vote themselves a pay raise. They get to go to work every single day, work their butts off. At the end of the day, they've got to deal with higher prices across the board, and they've got to send a big chunk of it to government.
Yeah.
And so I think fundamentally, the question here is, do we believe, one, that people need relief? And I would argue that there's clear evidence that they do. And two, do we believe that the money that people earns belongs to them, that they are in a better position to spend it than the government is? And if we believe that as conservatives, if we believe that as people who associate with the Republican Party, then in a lot of ways it is a no-brainer to work towards a solution where people get to keep a lot more of what they earn and ultimately invested in their families, invested in their businesses, invested in creating jobs and community across the board, and try and see real economic growth the way conservatives always believed economic growth occurs, which is in the private sector.
Yeah, totally agree. So what would you say to the Senate, who, of course, as you indicated, is concerned about protecting the integrity of the budget and ensuring that we don't blow a hole in the budget? You even see references to the so-called Kansas experiment, where they very abruptly, I think without a lot of forethought, honestly, dramatically reduced taxes and then had to go back and increase them to make up for revenue shortfalls. What would you say to them about the House plan and the years? Because I've got the fiscal note, which has 2 years in it, okay, where we're upside down and we're using prior surpluses to cover that deficit. But what about the out years? What do you expect there? And what do you say to the Senate that's worried?
So the first thing I would say is that the Kansas narrative is bunk. If you look at the development of the narrative on what happened in Kansas, it really emerged from leftist organizations and interest that wanted to make sure that states never again operated in a way where they tried to return tax dollars to the people who earned the money in the first place. If you look at what happened in Kansas, they dramatically reduced their unemployment rate in the years that they had done the income tax elimination. They dramatically increased the number of business startups they had. They had GDP growth that was the best they'd had in a very long time. Oftentimes, people confuse the size of government with the health of people and the state. And I would argue that we shouldn't confuse those two things. It is very possible for people to be doing well, for businesses to be doing well, and for government to be getting smaller and more efficient. The second thing I would say about Kansas, Gerard, is that it is a bad comparison because no plan that is presently out there looks anything like Kansas. And so it's a red herring of sorts that sort of starts at a place that puts people on the defensive. We're not doing what Kansas is doing. I think the question about whether or not we can afford it is really a question about whether or not we're willing to stop spending new money.
Yeah. Well, and at the federal level, Democrats in Congress frequently refer to Kansas even when discussing taxes at the federal level as well. That's just like their sort of template model for all that. We got Russ Latino, president of Empower Mississippi, in the studio. Stay Mississippi. Russ Latino, the president of Empower Mississippi, in the studio. We're talking about all things taxes. So I'm just going to make a real high-level assessment, Russ, and then let you talk, which is, really, I'm thinking like the business person here. In the House, on the House side, I think you could submit that you've got way more reward and maybe more risk. I mean, that's just the bottom line. And on the Senate side, not a whole lot of reward, not a whole lot of risk. That's usually the way economic decision-making works, and I think that's what we have here. I think certainly in terms of getting more relief to Mississippians, the House bill does that in a much greater way than the Senate bill, and that's what people want. The question is, will we fall under the weight of the lack of revenue that may be generated? And that's all speculative. Your thoughts about how we cover this reduction of income taxes that would likely result in less revenue? How do we do that?
So the first thing I would say, I think your synopsis is great. It's sort of simple, safe, and small versus bold and arguably riskier, right? And I would argue that the state should be leaning towards bold and riskier.
So do I.
Given our current position and the need to create an environment that generates real economic growth and opportunity for the people of Mississippi long term.
Yep.
The question about how you cover is a great question. It's a legitimate question, right? And it's the one that I probably get the most. If we eliminate the income tax, how do we fill the quote-unquote hole? Well, the way the House plan is designed, again, it's segmented between an initial cut and then a phase-in of the rest of the cut based on revenue growth, and there's some offset. The end result is still a much larger tax cut under that plan for virtually everyone. So the real rub is, what do you assume state revenue is going to be 5 years or 10 years from now? We're currently on pace to bring in about $7 billion in revenue in Mississippi, which is dramatically more, over $1 billion more than what the state historically has taken in as recently as pre-pandemic.
Yep.
We're probably on pace to spend somewhere around or appropriate somewhere around $6.2 billion. That includes the teacher pay raise, and if the House plan were to pass, that would include the $187 million, which is essentially the allotment for the car tag, where they're going to pay for half of the car tag expense and a credit that goes to the counties. So we're on pace for about $6.2 billion in spending and about $7 billion in revenue. That's an $800 million surplus on top of a surplus from last year. So there's plenty of cushion. And the question becomes, are we going to be in a place next year or 2 years or 3 years from now where that number goes back to $6 billion, which is about where we were pre-pandemic, or are we going to end up somewhere in that $6.5 billion range? And the math can work in that $6.5 billion range, and the math gets tight basically underneath that $6.5 billion range. I happen to believe we're not staying at $7 billion, that there's going to be some adjustment back downward to earth. I also believe we're not going to $6 billion. And if you look at the historic trajectory of revenue growth in Mississippi, over the last decade, pre-pandemic, we were averaging about 3.2% growth a year, which means a 33% growth over a decade. So at some point, these two lines meet.
Yeah.
And I'm talking nerdy economist stuff.
Yep.
But at some point, these two lines meet. I am not concerned about the picture around revenue. Where I would raise concern is if we continue to say, oh, well, what if we tacked on this additional spending? And what if we added this program? And death by 1,000 paper cuts that adds up to a huge amount of new spending that essentially eats away our potential to give money back. So what I would tell you is, I don't have any question that the state of Mississippi can afford a well-executed elimination of the income tax and that it would have a transformative impact. I have a question of whether or not legislators are going to return the money to the people or going to waste the money on new programs. And obviously, my extreme preference is that we return the money to the people who earned it in the first place.
Yeah. Okay, I'm totally on board with you. And got to point out that when I was testifying, as were you, last fall down at the joint committee meeting that Senator Harkins coordinated, And a number of folks testified, economists and so forth. That's kind of my parting message. We got to go big. We got to go bold here, or we're not really going to accomplish anything. And so it's you really do have to dig in and say, well, what's the goal of doing this? It's more than just putting a little bit more money in people's pockets. We want to grow. We want to boost economic activity, economic output. We want to provide more opportunity, keep our people here, and attract startup businesses, business expansion of existing businesses, all the above, because we're essentially going to be putting our reliance on sales taxes to fund government.
Zero doubt. I mean, first of all, I'd tell you there are a ton of economists that would tell you that a sales tax or a consumption tax is the most efficient way to raise revenue, the most stable way to raise revenue. You're taxing what people are taking out of the economy, not the productivity that people put into the economy. It's point of sale. There are a ton of reasons that consumption taxes are better suited for stability purposes and efficiency purposes than income taxes. Let me back up from the nerdiness though for a second.
Sure.
And say that Senator Harkins, Lieutenant Governor Hoseman, all those folks over there want to do good things for Mississippi.
Sure.
And I do think that there's some interest over there in figuring out how do you balance the needs of the core functions of government with returning money to the people. What I would suggest is that we need to be bolder if we want to have transformation.
Agree.
And I would also suggest that it's wrong to think about this in a binary sense, where the House has a plan to eliminate the income tax and the Senate has a plan to eliminate the 4% bracket, about $200 a year in savings. There are other ways to do this. And there are a lot of really smart people who are capable of contributing and thinking about other ways to do it. I'll spitball and say one thing that could be done is we could lower the top marginal rate from 5% to 4%. We would immediately be competitive with the state of Louisiana that just lowered theirs to 4.25% last year.
Yep.
That immediately puts 20% of the tax funds that would be paid by folks at that 5% bracket back into the economy. And then you phase out the rest of the income tax on a revenue trigger similar to the way the House designed.
That's another approach.
That's one idea that candidly could answer some questions that people have out there. There are tons of ways to skin this cat. The question is, can people coalesce around the goal? And I promise you, the math can be made to work in a way that has a real impact for Mississippi families. And to your point, the cumulative effect, when you got an extra $3,000 in your pocket, Gerard, you ain't sitting on it. You're going out and you're eating at restaurants, you're buying at shops. That means there are more jobs created. That means there are higher wages. That is how economic growth occurs, and that should be top of mind for the people who got voted to sit in those desks over there.
No, agree. And so my concern, frankly, with the Senate bill is that it provides a little bit of tax relief. I just don't think it has the same transformational effect. And that's what we're trying to achieve here, really. That should be the goal, more than just, okay, here's a few $100 in your pocket. And I just feel like that. And you and I are friends with all those folks involved in that.
Sure.
And I'm saying that it's in the most respectful way. Honestly, that's my concern, is that we're really not sort of moving the needle, as it said. Now, a question that comes up a lot, Russ, that I get frequently and have answered, but this is Hunter in DeSoto County, wants to know about counties, local governments, dealing with the shortfall in the reduction of ad valorem taxes on car tags, and that they get a wild hair and say, well, I'm going to raise that. But as we know, both bills actually cover and reimburse back to the counties those shortfalls or those losses in revenue from the diversion there on both sales taxes and on ad valorem taxes, sales taxes to the cities.
And the counties actually never experience a loss.
Right.
The state will pay a 50% credit on the car tag under the House plan. So if you had a $300 car tag, you would pay $150 to the county, and the state pays the other $150 as an example. Yeah. Of course, the Senate plan is much smaller. I think those numbers are something like $3 and $5 depending on who you talk to.
Yeah.
So the county doesn't lose any money that way.
Yeah, so I'm sorry if I gave that impression. They're not losing money. It's a reduction of car tax, no change to the county situation, to answer Hunter's question.
Correct.
So that shouldn't be a reason for them to raise ad valorem taxes.
And the same thing with the way that the grocery tax is designed. I suspect this will be in both bills.
It is.
Is the reduction of grocery tax means that the diversion that goes to cities from the grocery tax actually increases by design so that they get made whole. Counties and cities should not be worried about this. They're going to get made whole from a revenue point of view. What they should be doing is looking at it and saying, if the people in my city have an extra $1,000 or $2,000 a year in their pocket, that means they're going to spend it in my city. It means my city is going to be in a healthier position.
Totally agree.
Across the board.
Totally, completely agree. And I think sometimes that gets lost. They just tend to look almost impulsively as that, well, this is going down. Oh, my gosh, it's going to leave us a hole. And we need to be clear, the state has attended to that. In the original bill in the House, they didn't. But they heard the cities and the counties, and they've addressed it. You can hang around?
Yeah.
Yeah, we got another segment with Russ Latino of Empower Mississippi in the studio. Today's Gerard and Rhino in the studio, along with my good friend Russ Latino, the president of Empower Mississippi. We're talking all things taxes. So the other thing that comes up, Russ, frequently is what about the cuts in spending? We just it looks like we've got, I would say, broad consensus in the legislature to increase teacher pay. And, of course, education consumes, last I checked, 53% of our general fund budget. And so that's the biggest budget line item. Next on the list in terms of that, those programs which consume general fund dollars, Medicaid. And that's, of course, a jointly funded program with the state and the federal government. I think a lot of folks are surprised to find out that's number 2 on the list, almost $1 billion, $900-something million of state money. Then you come down to corrections and kind of everything else. So I don't know. Should we say let's don't raise teacher pay raise? Do we go to Commissioner Burlkane at corrections and say, sorry, you can't increase the pay for the custody officers, and he's so desperately trying to fill those needs? And you can just, and state troopers, Commissioner Sean Tyndall looking to try to increase that pay, which is ridiculously low, honestly. It's a tough one, isn't it? And then you get a consensus in that legislature on where to go, where to cut, how to do that is hard.
Yeah. So what I would tell you, and I'm going to back up a bit.
Okay.
I think the problem is that government is not willing to engage in what I would call creative destruction.
I totally agree.
A business, if you think about a business as a house, from time to time, a business will tear down a wall. They'll put in a new window. They'll change the house fundamentally. What government tends to do is add a new layer of paint. They don't ever change the house. And so there are all sorts of things that could be done to save money and not short shrift government.
Agree.
Part of the problem is, we've got all these rules in place, as an example, around personnel salaries. And we say, well, we're saving taxpayers money by putting all these caps in place. Well, you put a cap in place for $60,000 for a profession that requires you to pay somebody $100,000, and you end up having to hire 200 people at $60,000 instead of hiring 30 at $100,000. You have, in fact, wasted a ton of money.
Absolutely.
And there are a million examples like this in government currently where we're so afraid to tear down a wall and do things differently that we end up wasting a lot of resources and probably providing poorer services. So part of this is a willingness for people to really get their hands dirty and figure out what are those systems that have been in place for 50, 60, 70 years that fundamentally don't work. No business operates this way.
Yeah.
And I think you could find real savings. I think the other thing is, look, teachers deserve a pay raise. Teachers deserve to be well paid. There is a teacher shortage in the state. I think we can address core needs like that. The question to me is all of the other sort of tack-ons that end up happening. $1 million here, $2 million there, $20 million here. Before you know it, you're spending real money.
Especially at the end of the session.
Absolutely. So, again, to me, fundamentally, this is not a question about whether or not we can afford it. It's a question about whether or not we're willing to afford it and whether or not we're willing to try and do something that really transforms the state and gives us a new opportunity. Before we went to break, you mentioned like cities and counties, they're worried about what the revenue stream is going to look like.
Yeah.
And I just want to go back to this idea, one, that they're going to be made whole the way these bills are designed, so don't worry about that. But two, that we shouldn't be confusing the size of government with the health of our state. We shouldn't be confusing the size of government with the health of our communities and the well-being of people. Somewhere along the line, we got in our mind that if government can do more, It means people will be better off. And oftentimes that's a fatal conceit. We're talking about taking people's tax dollars and deciding for them what is best for them.
Yeah.
The reality is when people have the money that they earned in their pockets, they can invest in their families, their businesses, and their communities in a way that grows the economy for everyone, that presents opportunity for everyone. So we've got to be willing to jettison this idea that a huge government apparatus somehow equals people are better off.
Yeah.
It's simply untrue.
Well said. Absolutely well said. And I think that, honestly, just based on what I see on the text line, social media, I think the average person in Mississippi wants to see more effort to trim costs out of the state government. And when they see the trend continuing to increase, even though our revenues are increasing and we're keeping pace, which we are, which is great. We're producing surpluses, certainly. But they just want to see some effort. They want to see that number go down. They think, well, we've got supposedly an all-conservative government, Republican government. We should see that go down. And at least a decrease in the increase, if you will, and to see that sort of trajectory change. There just doesn't seem to be any organized, serious, concerted effort to really filter through every aspect of government with a fine-tooth comb and say, hey, is there a better way of doing this? Is there a more efficient, more cost-efficient way of doing this?
Absolutely. When you were in business, and I guess you're still in business, but when you owned your business, if you earned a profit, it's because people looked at what you offered as a service or a product and said, I will voluntarily give Gerard my money.
That's right.
Because I see that there is value in what he provides to me. When a government entity operates with a surplus, it's not because people have voluntarily sent in money.
Good point.
It's because that money has been extracted out of the economy, out of our families, out of our communities, candidly, by force of law.
By force, yep.
So the idea of the government having a surplus, what that means is the government took too damn much of our money.
Absolutely right.
And at some level, if we believe in people, if we want to see people take responsibility for themselves and transform this state, we've got to get out of the mindset that says all we need is more government or bigger government. And that shouldn't be too hard in a state that is supposedly one of the most conservative states in the country that elects supermajority Republican chambers.
It suggests the notion that the people in government are intellectually superior to the people not in government.
And I don't believe that's true.
You don't? Okay.
Well, obviously I don't believe
it suggests the concept. Let's put it that way.
I don't believe that most people sitting in those chairs feel that way.
Oh, I agree with you. I agree with you.
I think that there is this sort of inertia in government, which is there's always some new idea that we could try.
Yep.
And it's stopping and going, what was the big goal? What was the vision? Was the vision a group of people in the state of Mississippi that had the freedom and who were empowered and had the opportunity to go out and live their own American dream? Because if that's the vision, then government has to look fundamentally different. And we've got to trust people in their communities to be able to do that. Yeah,
totally agree. And we see this especially at the federal level with just more invasion into every aspect of the private sector in particular, which deeply disturbs me. But on a smaller basis right here in the state of Mississippi, talked to Secretary of State Michael Watson yesterday, who was discussing the enormous number of boards and commissions that we have, all of which are promulgating rules and regulations and making decisions that, frankly, impact our economy in a big way. And we all are affected by it.
I think Secretary Watson's initiative around tackling the tape in 29 by 29 is an excellent effort.
Yeah.
And we're sitting here talking about inflation, which is a hidden tax, a dramatic hidden tax increase on people. We're talking about tax policy and how to create an environment or a structure for growth. Regulation is another one of those things that people roll their eyes at or that they see as boring. But regulatory accumulation in this country costs the average man, woman, and child in every state in the country about $13,000 a year, just on the economic drag that's been created by the tremendous glut of regulations that are out there. We need to protect the public, but we need to be able to go back and say, that was too onerous, that is duplicative, that is outdated. How do we tear down walls instead of putting a new layer of paint and truly change the structure of a government that is modernized and able to keep up with what's going on in the private sector.
Yeah, you're right. It's a change in framework and underpinnings. And look, that's a more difficult task. But there's some smart people in the state that can sit around and figure this out. There just doesn't seem to be a lot of effort to do that, and that's, I guess, what I'm calling for. And maybe I'm wrong about that. You may know more about that than me.
The only thing I would say is there is a tendency towards wanting to avoid controversy.
Absolutely. And confrontation.
And so oftentimes what you see are ideas that aren't being forced into debate because people are afraid that, hey, we're going to end up with a split House or a split Senate.
Yep.
And I would say that, candidly, we're probably not doing our job as policy thinkers or policy makers if occasionally we're not pushing the envelope to do something that maybe might be a little controversial, but that disrupts the status quo and gives Mississippi an opportunity. Gerard, I left the practice of law because I had 2 kids, and I was like, I don't want them growing up in a state that's last in everything you want to be first in and first in everything you want to be last in. It's time to think big so that the next generation has more opportunity in this great state of ours.
Amen, brother, because it does no good for us to continue to improve our K-12 education, to send them to college if they abruptly leave when they graduate from college.
No doubt.
We're subsidizing the other states. I'm tired of that. Russ, always a pleasure. Good to see you. Appreciate you coming in. Great discussion, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you, sir.
You got it. Russ Latino, president of Empower Mississippi, has been our guest.